The Israel-Hamas conflict rages on in Gaza. Has a ceasefire and hostage release deal become less likely? Hello, I'm Arvind Vaidu, and this is The Heat. Israel continues its military assault on Gaza, where the Palestinian death toll is now about 41,000. Meanwhile, after the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages held by Hamas were recovered over the weekend, the prospect for a ceasefire deal may have dimmed considerably. There is much to discuss with our panel. Joining me now is Dan Arbell. He is a veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service and currently a scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. Also with us is Khalil Jahshan. He is Executive Director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. Joining the discussion too is Nabeel Khoury, the former U.S. diplomat, is now a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. And also with us is Edmund Ghareeb. He is a Middle East scholar and analyst. Welcome to all of you. Dan Arbell, let me start with you. Let's start with the killing of those 6 Israeli hostages. To what extent have those killings damaged what were already very slim chances for a ceasefire? Has that further hardened the position of the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu?
So first of all, the execution of these 6 innocent hostages by Hamas over the weekend is something that needs to be condemned in the strongest terms. They managed to survive for almost 330 days since October 7th in inhumane conditions, and have been executed as those in Hamas holding them sense that the IDF is getting closer to where they are, and that's what that's cost them their lives. Before that happened, the Netanyahu's cabinet passed a resolution which kind of talks about continued Israeli presence in the Philadelphia corridor. And that signaled in a way that Netanyahu is prioritizing the continued presence in Philadelphia corridor over a hostage deal. Unfortunately, Hamas murdered the hostages, but the Israeli government, led by Netanyahu, is not doing enough to seek their release and is not agreeing to a deal for their release and a ceasefire, despite international pressure, despite domestic pressure in Israel, where hundreds of thousands came out on Sunday night, Monday, Tuesday, to protest the government's policies. And so we're at this point where the U.S. is trying to salvage whatever is left from negotiations and try and reach a deal. Unfortunately, we're not there. Hamas is very stubborn, and he's holding the hostages, and has a lot of bargaining chips that it's holding. Israel, on its part, led by the Israeli government, is also being very stubborn and tough for reasons I do not understand, and or political reasons, which I do understand. It's not for strategic reasons, and this is where we're at. The U.S. is in this last-ditch effort to salvage a deal.
Khalil Jahshan, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he held a news conference on Wednesday. He continues to insist that it's Hamas which is to blame for the failure to reach a ceasefire. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
So I've gone out of my way. I've given leeway to our negotiating teams 5 times. 5 times. And I have areas of flexibility. But where I have to be firm, I'm firm. Where I can be flexible, I'm flexible. But in fact, the obstacle has been Hamas from the beginning. Everybody knows that.
So what do you make of that, Khalil, that the obstacle is Hamas?
Well, I mean, he's entitled to blame the other side, but he seems to distort the facts as if he is a party to a totally different conflict than we have witnessed over the past few weeks, and particularly the past few days. On the one hand, he talks about giving his negotiating team total leeway as a person who's fully aware of the behavior of the Israeli team at the negotiating table. I can tell you exactly the opposite has happened. Even the Israeli delegates themselves have repeatedly complained that they have been undermined by Netanyahu. By the time when they leave Tel Aviv, they have certain instructions. By the time they get to Doha or to Cairo, he reneges on the instructions that he gave them. So that's not Khalil Jahshan speaking. This is the Israeli team complaining about the lack of strategic depth and vision on the part of their own prime minister. So on the second issue, the killing, unfortunate killing of the hostages, look, it's very clear to me that Hamas has essentially changed its strategy in terms of guarding the hostages with the closer kind of intrusion of Israeli troops closer to areas where Hamas fighters have been hiding and holding these hostages. They have decided not to surrender these hostages. This is not new. We have seen this film before. It has happened during earlier hostage taking when Israel, Israel is not necessarily innocent in this regard. I agree with Dan that essentially Netanyahu has not done enough to release the hostages, but he certainly has done enough to get rid of them.
Dan, just to get some clarity on the Israeli negotiating position, is it the position that the Prime Minister on the one hand gives his negotiating team one mandate and then suddenly changes that mandate once negotiations start?
Yeah, I haven't been in the discussion rooms, but I do seem to listen very carefully to what members of the negotiating team are saying. And they are arguing, first of all, that they do not have enough leeway. They do not have enough, Netanyahu is not giving him enough options to work with. And they feel very strongly that some of the positions taken by Mr. Netanyahu are driven by his own personal political considerations rather than security strategic considerations. And therefore, there's certainly a gap between the negotiators themselves and Mr. Netanyahu. And the question is where, at what point will they decide that, enough is enough, and they'll stop, engaging in that. But clearly, Netanyahu's press conference today, in which he kind of put all the onus on Hamas, there is a lot that Hamas has to answer for. First and foremost, for the murders of these innocent people. But there is, Netanyahu does carry responsibility also for this very slow and very lingering process, which is not leading anywhere, unfortunately.
Nabeel, Khoury, I want to get back to something that we just heard a moment ago about Netanyahu placing more importance on the strategic interests of what the military is doing in Gaza over that of the welfare of the hostages. He, in fact, is doubling down right now, as we just heard, on an Israeli presence in that piece of Gaza territory, which is known as the Philadelphia Corridor. Now, as Israel insists on having this presence in Gaza, does that make the prospects of a ceasefire even harder?
Well, look, I never thought there were any real chances for these talks to succeed. I don't think they're really about the hostages. If I were advising Hamas, I would have advised them a long time ago to give up the hostages even unilaterally without an agreement. Because for Netanyahu, I don't think he gives a damn about the hostages. It's partly his own position that's at stake. And the right wing in his government wants these territories, not just Gaza, but eventually all of the West Bank, depopulated so that they could take them over. And the negotiations, I mean, the Philadelphia Corridor is just something made up. Egyptians will not accept, but then that doesn't make much difference. And whether the Israeli troops stay there or not is not a big issue. In the end, it's where you want to go with these negotiations. Do you want to withdraw completely and allow for the beginning of a Palestinian state or not? Otherwise, there's really nothing to negotiate about. And it's clearly obvious. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis that Netanyahu is not serious about a peace deal.
Nabeel, you say if you were to advise Hamas, you would advise them to release all the hostages right now. But there is another aspect to this, and that is the release of prisoners being held by Israel as well. If Hamas releases all the hostages, would you recommend that that be part of an exchange rather than just one side releasing the people it's holding?
Now, I would just do it as a one-sided, even if they get nothing in return, if for no other reason than to expose the Israeli strategy for what it is. These are red herrings. Palestinians have been in prison in Israeli jails for decades. So it's not just from October 7 that they have held some Palestinians. One prominent Palestinian in particular, Marwan Barghouti, is kind of the Nelson Mandela of the Palestinians, has been in an Israeli jail for 22 years, roughly. So this is not an issue.
Right.
And the Israeli hostages are a non-issue for Netanyahu.
Edmund Ghareeb, the New York Times reported on Wednesday that Qatari and Egyptian negotiators and U.S. officials, they pushing for an agreement. I mean, where do things now stand, you know, with regards to the release of hostages and, of course, the release of those prisoners that Israel's holding?
It's clear that the Israeli government, especially Prime Minister Netanyahu and the right wing and within Israel, do not want to see an agreement. Even the hostage families and missing forum said, and this is an Israeli group, they said that there has been a deal on the table for 2 months, and every time it seems that there's some progress has been made, the Israeli Prime Minister changes the rules of the game, adds new demands, makes different or backs out of commitments that that were made earlier. So all of this indicates that at least there is no interest on the part of the Israeli leadership. There was apparently also a sort of a clash between the Israeli defense minister and the Israeli prime minister last week over how important the Philadelphia path is to Israel. The defense minister, from what we've read in Hayom newspaper and the Israeli newspaper Yediot Ahronot, basically said that many of the security officials within Israel and the military officials did not consider the continued presence in Philadelphia as being significant or important. So all of this indicates that the Israeli prime minister apparently is, on the one hand, for example, we saw what the response when President Biden, even for the first time, when he was asked if the Israeli prime minister is creating putting hurdles in front of the agreement. And for the first time, President Biden said, put the blame on Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think the U.S. government wants to go ahead with the Qatari to achieve an agreement, but at the same time, also, I don't think the U.S. government is capable, willing, or able to put pressure on the Netanyahu government to change its stand.
Right, Dan Arbell, we've seen also a very serious and powerful political dimension, domestic political dimension to all of this in Israel. We've seen demonstrations, people taking to the streets in their thousands in Tel Aviv, saying that Netanyahu has not done enough to secure the release of the hostages. In fact, in some instances, there have been people who have actually been blaming him for the killing of these hostages. How serious is this threat, this growing threat to the current government?
So, if public opinion polls, recent polls show that 70% of the Israeli public wants to see Netanyahu out of office. There's very low trust in his leadership, in his how he handles the negotiations, how he's handling the hostage issue. The thing is that hundreds of thousands are taking to the streets. Many people that have not been out in the streets for a year or 2 years since the protests over against the judicial overhaul by the Netanyahu government. But you have to remember that the Israeli system, the parliamentary system, is where this coalition currently has 64 seats out of 120, so it's a pretty solid majority. And as long as this majority stays in place and no one leaves or no one switched sides, then Netanyahu is pretty much smooth sailing. And the next elections are not scheduled before the end of 2026. Yeah. So while the execution of these 6 hostages sent shockwaves through Israeli society and the Israeli public and led to these protests, and a lot of people are frustrated, upset, angry at Netanyahu. This is not translated immediately into political currency because the coalition partners of Netanyahu are sticking with him, and actually some of them are actually being said are said to be holding him hostage. Actually, the extreme right, issuing ultimatums that if he compromises on his positions, they will pull out of the government. That will be the end of the government. That will be the end of his term in office.
Khalil, Jahshan, looking at the situation in Gaza, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, almost 41,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th, 2023. At that news conference that Benjamin Netanyahu held on Wednesday in Israel, he was asked about that. He defended Israel's conduct of the conflict, even praising Israel for what he said were its distribution of humanitarian aid in Gaza. What do you make of that?
Frankly, this is not surprising, and it's not only Netanyahu. As Dan just explained, unfortunately, there is still a significant segment of Israeli society, in spite of the majority that would like to see an end to the war. There is still a significant portion of Israeli society or sector of society that agrees with Netanyahu, and he is appealing to them when he makes remarks of this sort. We've seen many people in the right or on the right in Israel basically expressing their feeling that it's irrelevant, that the Palestinians deserve it. They support Hamas. They accepted Hamas's rule. Therefore, 40,000 people are dead because of the mistakes of Hamas. That attitude is prevalent in Israel. Remember also that Israel has declared a certain objective. They do not repeat it as often because, frankly, it reminds people of the failure of the government and Netanyahu's failure, which is the elimination of Hamas. That has been the main declared objective of this war. It hasn't happened, and most probably it won't happen. The Israeli leadership itself is divided over this. It is also a point of division and disagreement between Washington and Tel Aviv that this objective is unrealizable. And when you get the defense minister, the top echelons of the military, the top echelons of the intel agencies, 2 or 3 former prime ministers, and the families of the hostages above all, disagreeing with the prime minister on this issue, something is wrong in Peoria, as they say. So something is rotten. There is a big gap between public opinion and this government in Israel. Netanyahu has lost, as Dan explained a few minutes ago, the confidence of the Israeli people, his followers. It's kind of similar to some political phenomena we see in this country. Some of his key supporters still stick with him, if you will, or continue to support him, but he's losing ground, definitely, in the long term.
Right. Nabeel, Khoury, looking at the broader impact of this conflict right now, I mean, you've just returned from Lebanon where, there are very high tensions. They're still running high, those tensions, over the ongoing back and forth confrontations that we're seeing between Hezbollah forces and Israel on the northern border there. I mean, there have been concerns over this probably escalating into a wider conflict. But for now, have those concerns receded?
To some extent, the chances of an all-out war have receded, but there is an ongoing war on a daily basis, mainly in the south of Lebanon and the northern part of Israel. There is also, of course, the war going on in Gaza and in parts of the West Bank. The Biden administration, I think sincerely, does not want to see an all-out war in which Iran participates and all the members of the axis of resistance participate at once. It would have to intervene itself, and there's no telling where that war might go. However, short of an all-out war, the Biden administration supports the ongoing violence, and it is considerable. In Lebanon, I can tell you that the summer season has been cut short.
Yeah.
Thousands of visitors, Lebanese who live abroad in the US, in Europe, who come to visit their families, left early because of fears of an all-out war. There are, again, other than the violence in the south, Israeli warplanes fly over Lebanon, and sometimes they bomb parts of the Bekaa Valley, or they bomb deep in Syria from over Lebanon. The jokes in Lebanon is that people set their watches by the Israeli jets breaking the sound barrier, which sounds like a big explosion if you have never heard one of those before. So there is fear, there is tension. The Lebanese, as usual, are divided. Some people do not want to see Lebanon dragged into a war, but many Lebanese support what Hezbollah is doing, and they feel it's the right thing to resist Israeli aggression, not just in Gaza, but the potential desires that the Israeli right wing have for Lebanon.
Edmund Ghareeb, there are also concerns over how Iran is going to retaliate for the attack on its territory. That attack killed a senior member of Hamas. The political director, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated in Tehran. Iran has vowed to respond. We haven't seen anything yet, but how great is the risk that that could happen? And that could be the trigger for an even bigger conflict.
Absolutely. I think this is one of the dangers, one of the threats. But the Iranians have said is that they are not going to take any action that might affect the negotiations for the release of the hostages, for a permanent ceasefire. But at the same time, I think if this fails, we might see some activities by Iran. I think one of the concerns, on the one hand, is that it's not only the humanitarian situation that we're seeing in Gaza, and now there is also another campaign against the West Bank, and the Israeli foreign minister saying that the people should move, should be from the area. But we've seen that in Gaza when Israel would ask the population to move from let's say, from the north to the south. If they move to the south, they are bombed in the south. And most of the people who are dying are the civilians. At the same time, this is one danger. The other danger is exactly what we've heard from your esteemed guests, basically about what's going on in South Lebanon. And then there is the question of Iran. And Iran, actually, now apparently the other countries in the world seem to be concerned. The Chinese foreign minister, for example, issued a statement in which he said China supports Iran's right to security, dignity. And at the same time, there are reports that the Russians have begun to send some weapons to Iran, missiles, electromagnetic gear, etc., that might be helpful. That indicates that we might see something coming from Iran if there is no agreement. And this is what is worrisome, because this would be much more explosive than we have seen even up until.
Dan Arbell, the Israelis are also under pressure for their actions in the West Bank. I mean, Israeli troops, Israeli settlers have been attacking Palestinians there. On Wednesday, a UN agency accused Israel of quote-unquote warlike tactics. I mean, How does Israel justify what it's doing in the West Bank right now, which under international law is considered occupied land?
Anand, we have to distinguish between two things. First of all, settler violence against Palestinians is unacceptable and should be condemned, and there's no room for it. And it's not official policy, although some of the settlers do get some backing from extreme right ministers who are part of the coalition. But there's the IDF actions on the ground in the West Bank. As Hamas is raising its head there, there's Hamas cells or Hamas operatives.
Yeah.
There's jihad operating in and around Jenin. And so the IDF needs to respond to these threats to security as the level of threats has risen, and there are every day almost alerts that perhaps terrorists are on their way to conduct suicide bombing attempts and so on and so forth. So IDF needs to crack down on these terrorist cells, and that's what justifies IDF's actions. Settler violence is another thing, and as I've said, should be condemned in the strongest terms.
Right, Khalil, Jahshan, I've just got about a minute left, but I want to address one other development in Gaza, and that is we saw that outbreak of polio among Palestinians in Gaza. The United Nations, World Health Organization, acted against that. There's been a vaccination program that's been introduced, and they released a statement saying that 189,000 people have been vaccinated thus far. What do you know of the situation there?
The situation is still, I think, very tense in the sense that these international agencies have managed to secure the supply needed in order to inoculate the large number of children in Gaza, which is close to like almost 1 million kids that need it. And they haven't been able, because of the fighting and, if you will, the dismantlement and the destruction to the health system, to be able to reach all these. So the numbers remain limited. Even 200 is not enough.
Right. Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.